Yes. Okay, Article 19, based in London, but with many regional offices around the globe, is the organization who has taken the initiative to the meeting here today. So I'm very happy now to give the floor to the Executive Director, Thomas Hughes, and to Deputy Quinn McKew. Please.
Joachim, thank you very much, and many thanks also, obviously, to the other co-hosts of today's event, and especially, of course, Fritt Ord, for allowing us to have the event in such a wonderful location. I must say it's very rare that you get to hear a foreign minister speaking so clearly, and I think so poignantly, and so directly on a topic, and especially around press freedom issues. And I do want to thank the Norwegian Foreign Ministry specifically for their commitment, and also to encourage the Foreign Ministry and the Foreign Minister to speak and engage with other foreign ministers around the world, because one of the issues that really is a core challenge to this topic, and we'll go into that during the course of this presentation, is political will. It's the willingness of ministers, of ministries, of governments to speak clearly, to put aid before trade, and to think very concretely about how they can and the influence they have to change situations on the ground. So attacks on journalists are undoubtedly the most insidious and I think high-profile form of suppression of freedom of expression. And it's undoubted that the attacks continue unabated. There are small changes in the statistics, but they continue unabated. And as has been pointed out earlier today, and I think will be pointed out repeatedly during the course of the day, almost with entire impunity. And of course, I think as Knut mentioned this morning, when we talk about attacks, we think obviously automatically about killings and about enforced disappearances. But actually, it's a broader, bigger picture. It's a picture in which we have to think about legal threats, we have to think about surveillance, we have to think about physical intimidation, arbitrary arrests and detention, and actually more types of intimidation besides those few. And whilst the killings of Khashoggi and Galizia, of course, are heinous and horrifying, they are very unfortunately just the tip of the iceberg. And there is a huge number of journalists around the world, often local journalists who are working in small, remote communities far from their capital cities, reporting on issues like construction or environmental damage or religion or organized crime, who are really at the forefront of these attacks, who are the ones who are most vulnerable and the ones who we unfortunately hear least about. So what we want to do today, Quinn and I, is to give you a bit of an insight into what we will be publishing on the 5th of December, which is the Expression Agenda report, which looks at our Expression Agenda metric, and to talk a little bit about specifically the protection-related aspects of those and what we think the metric tells us about trends, but also what is going to be upcoming in the future. Quinn.
So as we've noted multiple times today, freedom of expression is under attack around the world. But given the richness of what's included in expression, how do you measure it? This has been a challenge for a while because freedom of expression is not just the killings and attacks on journalists. It's much broader than that. The world needs a way to look at the complexity of expression and information to see where we're advancing and where we're falling back. Governments, journalists, and civil society all need a way to track what is happening, to intervene to support expression, and to investigate and share what is going right. Now more than ever, when the internet is posing both challenges and opportunities for expression, we need to understand both the big picture and the more detailed and nuanced country view. With the Expression Agenda metric, Article 19 is introducing a rigorous way of measuring expression around the world in all of its complexity. By partnering with the VDEM Institute at the University of Gothenburg, we now have a universal, comparable, rigorous, independent assessment of freedom of expression in the world in all of its richness and complexity. VDEM, which stands for Varieties of Democracy, has created a multidimensional data set which examines 350 aspects of democracy, enabling a cutting-edge analysis that presents all of this landscape for freedom of expression. There are over 300 scholars and country experts that rank these 350 plus indicators for over 200 countries, dating back to the 1800s, giving us the world's most comprehensive database of the different aspects of democracy over this period of time. Article 19 worked with VDEM to select 32 out of the 350 plus indicators to really look at the different aspects of expression in the world, whether it's journalists, whether it's transparency. We have now put these indicators together into 5 indices based on the way that we think that expression is felt and realized in the world, in 5 defining indicators and indices: protection, digital, media, transparency, and civic space. We specifically sought out indicators that could be disaggregated by gender, such as freedom of discussion for women and men, and access to justice for women and men, to allow us to understand the different challenges to expression based on a gender perspective. The result of this collaboration is a first of its kind comprehensive view of the state of expression around the world. So before I show the metric, I want to explain a little bit what you're seeing here. These, for each country on our metric, and we assess, again, the 200 countries in the world, we've created what we've called a pentafoil. So the brighter and bigger the circles on the pentafoil, so civic space, protection, transparency, and media, the better the situation for freedom of expression in the country. The darker and smaller, the worse the situation is. So as you can see, looking at the expression metric, the higher performing countries on this side, the worst down there at the tail end. Not surprisingly, North Korea is the one at the smallest ends down there. Norway and Denmark are up here in the top thirds. You can see that we are far away in the world from actually fulfilling the true fullness of freedom of expression and information. There's a pretty big tail end, a pretty dark, big tail end down there before we can really say that freedom of expression is fully protected in the world. So what's driving this? Right now, it's being driven in large part by the fact that media freedom is at its lowest point since the turn of the century. Indicators from our media index on government censorship of the media, lack of media pluralism, and self-censorship show alarming declines around the world. The decline in the media index in particular is driven by self-censorship, tied deeply with the entrenched impunity of violence against communicators that we've talked about today. Additionally, the protection index demonstrates that harassment of journalists, political killings, media self-censorship, and worsening access to justice for women and men, and repression of civil society are all on the rise globally. Of the list of countries whose freedom of expression environment is in decline, about 24, so 20 of the 24 that we've seen a statistical decline in have seen the deterioration in protection and safety. Additionally, every country which measured a decline in freedom of expression between 2014 and 2017 also measured a decline in transparency. Those seeking to entrench their power do not want to be held accountable for their citizens, which also, again, relates to the issue of impunity. Later, I will discuss some specific examples going into some of the depth of the different country analyses that come out of the metric. But first, Tom will address what the different complementary data sets from our partner organizations, plus ours, say about the state of impunity in the world.
Thank you, Quinn. And I would strongly encourage you also, just before I get into this slide, to go and have a look at what we call the B-swarm, the previous slide, online. Quinn's going to talk about that in more detail in a second. But actually, we did a tabulation for what that looked like pre the end of the Cold War. And it's fascinating to see. You've basically got 2 big chunks with a small connecting line between them. So you can have this visual idea of how freedom of expression has changed not only over the last couple of years, but actually over the last decades as well. So there is a lot of data that is available, and it's very important, of course, to give some consideration as to what those other data sets tell us, what they are, and how they fit together, and what can be done with them. And I would say that we're in a very data-rich situation, but it's not a situation in which there is excessive duplication. And in fact, I would say it's a situation in which it provides opportunity and provides tailored focus around specific types of violations, which can be used to look at a broader picture, of course, but can be used in specific types of advocacy with different governments. So there is, as I say, a lot of data being collected, but at the same time, a lot of purpose behind each of the different data sets. And my goal here today is just to quickly run through some of those that exist to ensure that, that we've had a discussion on this as well. The other thing I want to mention, which is extremely important, is the need to connect the various pieces of data that are available to actual implementation on the ground. And that's something that Article 19 has been working closely together with International Media Support and Free Press Unlimited, bringing together 20 of the leading international organizations working on protection-related issues and impunity issues to really see how we can connect data and monitoring to implementation and delivery on the ground. So very, very briefly, because each one has a lot more depth behind it, of course. But of course, you've got the Unesco data, as was mentioned earlier. So unfortunately, 68 deaths recorded in 2018, 78 last year, 102 the year before. Some of the worst countries from 2017, including Mexico, Afghanistan, and Syria. You've got OHCHR and the UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, who, I should say, does not per se produce an index or a metric, but all of the individual complaints that are filed to the Human Rights Council about cases are on the Freedex website, are on the website once the states have responded to them. And we're also working, again, with many of these organizations and FPU and IMS, and have built something called the Rea Platform, which is reporting attacks on expression, where we will be working together with other civil society to actually channel individual communications and complaints via the Special Rapporteur into the Human Rights Council for state responses. So that will give us, for the first time, a really comprehensive data set that has been through, let's say, the UN process and has, where possible, where states want to respond, has state responses provided for them. Of course, you have IFJ's 74 attacks registered in 2008 as they track attacks on journalists and media staff killed around the world. And I know, sorry, I just had it in my hand, that obviously they've got their 2017 publication, and I'm sure Jeremy will speak to this in brief later on. RSF have reported 77 journalists killed in 2018, and of course, very importantly, they have their World Press Freedom Index, which tracks abuse and attacks and violence against journalists worldwide. And of course, as has been mentioned already, Norway is at the top of that list, as in being the best, not the worst, I should say clearly, but at the top of the list. IPI produce a Death Watch list that has 71 journalists attacked in 2018. CPJ, of course, very importantly, they look at this from a slightly different perspective. So they do their impunity index, which ranks countries with the greatest number of unsolved murders. That includes countries such as Somalia, Syria, Iraq, South Sudan, and the list goes on. Freedom House, again, a slightly different perspective. They rank freedom of the press, looking at the independence of the media. Again, at the bottom, no surprises, North Korea, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan. And IREX do a media sustainability index, which used to be global, but now focuses on Europe and Eurasia specifically. But again, at the bottom, Azerbaijan, Bulgaria, Russia, and so on. And of course, Article 19, and this is not a reference to the expression agenda metric, but rather that some of our regional offices around the world, so Mexico, Bangladesh, Kenya, Brazil, they produce national reports about protection and impunity and attacks on journalists and communicators more broadly. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to ask Quinn again to introduce the expression agenda metric in more depth. Thank you, Quinn.
So we've been having some fun with our metric, and I want to share with you some of the fun that we're having with it and the ways that it can really be used to kind of interrogate the state of expression in the world. When we release the metric, one of the things that you'll be able to see, and one of the benefits of the expression agenda metric, is the ability to look at data organized by region, but also by theme. This is something new that we've done this year in terms of the way that you can analyze the data compared to the past. So this is the 2017 bee swarm that you can see here. This is the way it looks for all of the expression index ranked together. Again, you have one of the things, if you click on the countries, this is kind of a bad example because you can't see it very well, but it brings up specific data about the state of expression on the 5 indices there. And so for North Korea, you can see that it's pretty much at 0 for the trend line. It starts at 2007 and runs to 2017 down here, so 2007 to 2017. So for each of the countries, you can actually interrogate a little bit more what the data is saying there. But since we're here to talk about impunity, I will select what the B swarm would look like if we just focused and ranked countries based on their position on protection. The protection indicator, or the protection indice for us, again, includes indicators on media self-censorship, harassment of journalists, access to justice for women and men, freedom of political killing, and civil society repression. So organizing it this way allows you to look at some of the key advancers and decliners relative to geography and looking at the factors driving placement of the countries. So for example, this is protection. You could also then rank by looking at different regions in the world. So if you select on Africa, the metric then just shows you the countries in Africa and where they're placed on the protection index. So Burundi, right here, represents an extreme example of the trends that we are seeing globally. It has seen the sharpest decline in the state of freedom of expression in the region over the last 3 years, according to our analysis, with a 54% decline between 2014 and 2017. The country has also seen the sharpest or steepest global decline in the area of media freedoms over the same period. So in 2015, what's driving this, the Burundi president sparked chaos by standing for a controversial 3rd term, sending Burundi down a path of political violence and human rights abuse. Security forces and members of the youth wing of the ruling party targeted opponents and perceived opponents with torture and killings, while prominent human rights organizations were banned. The legal harassment is continuing in 2017, including criminal defamation charges being leveled at journalists in reprisal for their work. An increasing number of journalists have now sought asylum in neighboring countries, fearing for their safety. The XpA data shows that between 2014 and 2017, the biggest drop in any of Burundi's indicators actually was related to this, which is the range of political perspectives represented in print and broadcast media, as people have been driven out of the country. A different story can be seen in the Gambia. Under the new President Barrow, following years of repressive dictatorship, huge improvements are already being seen in the enjoyment of the rights of freedom of expression and freedom of association. According to the XpA data, the Gambia is the biggest global advancer on freedom of expression, seeing a substantial improvement, particularly in media freedoms and in the indicators related to the harassment of journalists over the past year. The XpA data suggests that the Gambia saw a 67% increase in freedom of expression during 2017, according to our metric. Media freedoms are hugely improved, and the grip of self-censorship itself is loosening. Under the previous president, coverage of sensitive topics could result in arrest and detention, but now more people are entering journalism, and more journalists that were driven into exile are returning back to the country. If we look at a different region, Europe and Central Asia, to see how that looks, we see echoes of the same themes: increasing authoritarianism leading to repression to preserve power, expression restricted under vague and broad anti-terrorism laws, and increase in online restrictions and internet censorship. Perhaps no particular country embodies these trends more than Turkey, which is a particularly extreme example. Turkey recorded one of the largest negative drops in the expression agenda metric in 2017. Turkey's expression crackdown continued throughout the year following the attempted coup. Emergency powers and anti-terrorism laws were weaponized to restrict both media and civic space. The government spent much of the year consolidating its power, purging perceived enemies by judicial and other means. Turkey's score as a whole fell annually by 17% between 2014 and 2017. The prosecution of journalists and the closure of media outlets continued unabated, with the majority of cases brought against writers in Turkey falling under anti-terrorism investigations. More than 150 media outlets were closed in 2017, and more than 150 media workers were in prison at the end of 2017, making Turkey the world's largest prison for journalists. The penal code criminalizes defamation, and websites are blocked frequently. Freedoms were hit as hard online as offline, with repeated suspension of telecommunications networks and access to social media, and many arrested for expression online. But the declines, as you can see in Turkey, are not solely a result of the coup. The metric data clearly demonstrates that the overall negative path of Turkey began earlier under Erdogan and even prior to him. Also found at the bottom end, oh, where is it? There we are. Also found at the bottom end of the metric is Uzbekistan, but a closer examination of the data reveals a slightly different path for the country. While still one of the lowest ranked countries globally with a strongly and deeply entrenched authoritarian power, Uzbekistan has in 2017 made some tentative steps towards improvement and is actually one of the advancing countries in our metric for 2017. Since there was a newly elected president, there have been small positive developments with the government's attitude towards independent media, with some formerly imprisoned journalists released and exiled journalists being invited to return. Live discussion programs began appearing in 2017 on television, adding to a trend of more critical media commentary on corruption and other problems. However, websites of independent media organizations critical of the government continue to be blocked, both on a temporary and a permanent basis, and it's increasingly difficult for independent media organizations and journalists to acquire official registration, leaving them vulnerable to attacks. However, if you compared, Tom mentioned earlier, the data kind of that you could see kind of historically going back to the Cold War, but if you actually just looked 10 years ago to 2007, you would see that Uzbekistan and Turkey are in fact getting very close to passing each other in the metric. In 2007, Turkey was more up around here, while Uzbekistan was pretty much down here at the very end. And now Uzbekistan is going this way and Turkey is going this way, giving an example of how this metric can be used to look at trends in country movement over time. Tom? Sorry, I just have to pull back up the presentation. And I don't know, can't speak Norwegian, so you guys will have to tell me which one actually means starting the slide presentation. This one? Here we are, from the beginning. There we go. Thank you for your patience. There you go.
So thanks very much, Quinn. The expression agenda metric, as I mentioned, will be published on the 5th of December. Within the report, there are in-depth analysis across the 5 different themes that Quinn mentioned, as well as in-depth country analyses as well from selected countries. They were the countries with the circles around them that you saw on the metric itself. And you can also go online and interrogate the data and also download some of the data as well. What we wanted to do to finish this presentation was to talk very briefly about some of the trends that are highlighted in the expression agenda report. And some of these are trends that have already been mentioned already this morning. And I think they are trends that certainly the 2 panels to follow are going to go into in a lot more depth. But these are some of the things that we think are some of the pertinent points highlighting from 2017 into 2018. And the first one is the obvious one, the glaring one, that impunity remains the norm. Now, UNESCO's 90%, that's not UNESCO's figure, but the figure that UNESCO has produced, this 90% figure, is already deeply concerning. But when you look at that, when you interrogate that for specific countries, whether it be Mexico or whether it be Pakistan, actually it's 100%. It's not 90, it's 100. There's total impunity in many of the worst countries that we're talking about. It's even worse than we thought it was. And that is a trend, and I know there's a panel on this in the afternoon, that we have to get to grips with. We have to be able to reverse, otherwise the situation will not improve. Another one is that these attacks are becoming more ubiquitous. With 3 attacks in Europe and 4 in the United States in the last year, that is an unprecedented change. And also connected to that, as was mentioned earlier, for the first time, more attacks outside of conflict zones than in conflict zones. And previously, maybe in years past, rather than in recent years, often politicians have dismissed this as something that happens in conflict zones and is therefore something that is really very difficult to try and engage and so on. That trend is now over. I think that trend has clearly changed. We've also seen in the last couple of years growing digital threats, and specifically relating to surveillance and forms of digital attack. Of course, the Pegasus attacks in Mexico and also more recently uncovered in Saudi Arabia are deeply disturbing, but probably only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the scale of digital attack that's faced. And there is also a growing number of attacks on female journalists, which have historically been, we feel, and I think others would share this, underreported. And because a lot of the focus has been on physical attacks and murders, these types of attacks have traditionally not had attention. And they include things like blackmail and threats of sexual assault, intimidation, stalking, surveillance, and the release of private content without consent online. And of course, sorry, I forgot, very, very importantly, threatening of family members as well. So why is this happening? Well, it's an irony that we have at the international level ever stronger international standards. And actually the latest Human Rights Council resolution was mentioned from September. It's a very strong resolution. It calls for the first time for politicians to stop denigrating media. It reinforces a lot of the international standards. And these are standards that Article 19 and others are very familiar with, because we work very hard and very extensively to try and ensure that these standards are retained within, whether it be Third Committee or whether it be Human Rights Council resolutions. And we also have, as was mentioned, the UNESCO Plan of Action. Now, the crucial thing here is both consideration of time frame, but also the fact that these must be used. So these standards, although they are continually reinforced, and that is to a large degree the nature of the institutions through which these resolutions are being passed. They come back every year, these resolutions. They need to be reaffirmed. It's not that there's an endless discussion that's not, that sort of is in some sort of cycle that never ends anywhere. So if you consider 6 years on a broader scale, it's not that long in reality. And what we need to do is to continue to maintain those resolutions, but to talk and to find ways to actually ensure that they're implemented on the ground. And that is coming. It's coming slowly, too slowly, but that is coming. So despite those resolutions, obviously we've seen a rise of politicians denigrating journalists. This is not just about Donald Trump, although he is probably the most obvious and the most well reported on individual who denigrates and attacks, verbally attacks journalists. But we see this from the US to Cambodia to the Philippines, and of course, most recently in the elections in Brazil, where journalists are being individually identified and individually denigrated and attacked. And that does, let's not pretend that it doesn't, that does have a direct correlation to physical attack. That does lead to violence against journalists. We also see enabling environments around the world continuing to be undermined. So these are legal environments, and whether it be through issues around national security and counterterrorism, whether it be eroding whistleblower and source protection, whether it be for greater threats or greater penalties for defamation online, all of this is a trend that we see in different manners in different countries, but a trend that is accelerating. The only counter-trend really is around access to information legislation, where more and more countries keep passing that legislation. But again, it's a negative trend. And unfortunately, we see new issues, new threats, new standards being put on the table by governments, whether it be around fake news, and that's not to belittle the threat, if I can put it that way, that's posed by disinformation and misinformation, but actually the response of governments by creating fake news legislation is more of a threat to press freedom than the actual misinformation in the first place. And there needs to be a broader understanding that information systems are messy, and that journalism is not, it may be striving for the truth, but it is not truth unto itself. And there needs to be recognition of that by governments around the world, and not to try and create a legal responsibility to have acquired truth, which is, of course, by definition, unacquirable in a way. And there's also other issues around, countering violent extremism and so on and so forth. There's also the question of law enforcement and prosecutors and judiciary lacking both independence, but also training. We have some really good examples where the judiciary has stood up. We've got Kenya, we've got earlier this week Pakistan in the case of Asia Bibi. But at the same time, you have judiciary and courts in Myanmar or Turkey which are entirely co-opted and in a sense entirely useless in terms of their protection of press freedom. And then we have a lack of resources for the media communities themselves. Financial resources, particularly in environments where income generation is falling, not rising, but also resources in terms of tools and opportunities for training, whether that be on legal, physical, or digital safety. So, what needs to be done? Well, first of all, there needs to be a change. There needs to be more political will in the domestic situation, but also in the international context. So, political will, as we saw this morning from the foreign minister, that is crucial. Persuading other foreign ministers to do the same, even more important. But political will domestically, particularly where there's a change of government, whether it be in Mexico, whether it be in Gambia, the new authorities actually being held to account to deliver what they've said they would do, and actually ensuring that there are independent prosecutors and that there's no interference with the judiciary and that law enforcement are properly resourced and that cases are completed and that protection mechanisms are in place. So political will is a crucial component. Secondly, as I just mentioned, there needs to be a strengthening of protection mechanisms. The best case scenarios we feel are where you have civil society mechanisms alongside state mechanisms, and they can function together, they can speak together. There will always be cases where journalists don't want to be protected by the state. That is entirely understandable, and in many cases for very good reason. Civil society mechanisms can pick up those cases. They can also, from a grassroots perspective, push more cases. And at the same time, state mechanisms can often provide the type of protection that obviously civil society simply can't, particularly around physical protection. There needs to be, we need to ensure that there are strong enabling legal environments. So again, legal environments need to be looked at honestly and in depth, and laws that are pushing back against press freedom, that erode the role of journalists and communicators more widely, need to be taken off the statute books, and new laws, progressive legislation needs to be brought in. And there needs to be broader consideration, I think, particularly around the prosecute element of what we'll be talking about today. And as I mentioned earlier, there is actually already extremely good coordination between the international organizations that are working on protection and impunity-related issues. But we need to bring in broader cross-sections of international community. We need to bring in the international legal community. We need to understand about prosecution and judicial processes. We need to make sure that these prosecutions actually take place, and there are powerful, strong international voices being brought to that table at the same time. And the last one I've spoken about already, but it's the rights before trade issue. You know, governments need to understand that human rights are not something that are left at the bottom of the agenda just to be brought in and sort of flourished at the end. Many countries around the world, United Kingdom, United States, that's exactly how human rights are treated. I'm very pleased to say that that doesn't seem to be the case for Norway, but other countries need to step up and they need to reconsider how they look at human rights. So, to conclude, going back to the expression agenda metric, it of course provides what we hope is a very broad but also a very in-depth understanding of freedom of expression and information. It looks across those 5 themes, so it takes into consideration other elements, but of course specifically also around this issue of protection and impunity. We hope that we certainly will, but everyone can use it as an advocacy tool, but also very importantly, as I mentioned earlier, a guide for implementation, a guide in terms of selecting which countries to work in, but also, as we plan to use it, to see what the impact of your work has been. I would hasten to add over extended periods of time rather than over just short periods of time, but to actually try and track and measure impact at the same time. So again, it's going to be released on the 5th of December. It'll be online. There'll also be hard copies published as well. And we would encourage you to dig into it, to analyze it, to come back to us and tell us where you think it's wrong, where you think trends have been misidentified, but also, very importantly, hopefully to promote it and use it in your daily work. So thank you very much. Oh, sorry, yes, of course. And are there any questions?
You're all very polite.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
Do I just speak without
I think a microphone is on its way.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm going to ask a question that I was going to ask the minister, but she left before I had a chance to do that. And I think it relates to an otherwise, I think, fantastic presentation she did, and this is also enormously important what you have just outlined here. I would probably have liked a little bit more clarity about what it adds to other indexes that are already there. I'm not sure. I'm sure it does. I know you're thorough about your work. I'm sure you've identified a gap, but maybe you can say a little bit about that. But I think the minister raised this issue about closing the gap between all these international resolutions, all the standards that we have at international level. You're very hopeful that the international resolutions, as they are repeated every year, adds on new language around this issue, eventually will have some impact on this lack of political will that we see around the world. I'm less hopeful. Of the action points you mentioned, there was one action point which may be able to address this. I'm not sure. I want your reflections on this. And this is, and you know what that is when you know me well, Thomas. Strengthening protection mechanisms at national level. I think we are sometimes diverting ourselves by mentioning so many action points instead of saying where is it really that we need to make a difference? How can we close this gap? There is a fundamental imbalance in the way we focus on this issue at the moment. There's too much attention on international resolutions, there's a Human Rights Council report in September following the resolution, which outlines it's a 15-page document of all the international mechanisms that already exist, attempting to address this issue. So that's my question and comment.
Thank you. 3 questions, I think they're buried in there somewhere. So the role of international resolutions is not only to create political will, of course. The way that Article 19 uses them and other organizations use them as well is through the creation of soft law, which we then try and see being translated into legislation or jurisprudence to try and change situations on the ground. So that's a very legalese, that's a very legal response. So there is room and scope for some organizations to focus in that kind of response, and I think other organizations should try and take other responses. I agree with you. I completely agree with you that these resolutions need to be implemented on the ground, which is why also Article 19 not only does the international work, but also works on the ground across different countries, and why we've created this coalition of international civil society organizations to try and coordinate and focus on the delivery on the ground. I think when you talk about individual countries, you need the breadth. You need to say, well, what does this country need? From all of these different tools within the UN Plan of Action or within these resolutions, which are the key components? Do you need a prosecutor, or is it a protection mechanism? Should you be looking at legislation around defamation, or actually is it blasphemy you need to focus on? What affects journalists in that country? Why are they being attacked? And how are you going to reverse it? And how are you going to protect them? And there's no one fit. There's no one solution to all countries. There are, of course, some fantastic examples, like in Colombia or Mexico, of institutions that have been created sometimes without political will, so they haven't been able to be acted on properly, that can be reused, but there is no one solution. The metric itself, I want to be a bit careful to try and compare it to other metrics, because that draws me down the path of maybe trying to up ours and not others. But what our metric is a very broad analysis of freedom of expression and information. And it takes into consideration issues ranging from blasphemy and public participation all the way through to digital rights and attacks on journalists. So whilst a lot of the other indices, which are very valuable because they provide very specific references to cases and also look at cases from different perspectives, whether it be the attacks or whether it be impunity, and obviously IREX and Freedom House looking more broadly at systems of media, our metric looks very broadly at a multitude of components that are required for a healthy situation for freedom of expression and information. We also hope that it will give us, and the way we've tried to outline it is to give us trends. So we would like to try and use it, for instance, so Uzbekistan was a very good example. We would like to use it to take the data, and the challenge, to be very honest, that we have at the moment is that we're still producing it too late in the year. We want to try and produce it earlier in the year, but this is only the second iteration. But to take the data and look at which countries are going up and which are going down, and what that means for why we've targeted them and how we deliver activities in them. And over time, we want to also look at countries where we've invested heavily, together with other partners, and to see what impact may or may not be seen on those trends within that country. We want to be a bit cautious with that, of course, because there are so many other factors that come into play. But if we can try and chart a trend and try and over time see how changes in countries map against investment as compared to general trends within regions, I think that would be quite valuable and very worthwhile doing. And sorry, yes, but there was a third question, and anyway, have I answered your question? Yes, but sorry. Well, that's the implementation gap. I think I did answer that. Okay. Are there any other questions?
Could you just explain to us once again your main source of the data?
Sure. So all of the data right now from the Expression Agenda report comes from the Varieties of Democracy project, which is run out of the University of Gothenburg in Sweden and also University of Notre Dame, but is a collaborative academic effort, again, with between 2,800 and 3,000 academics in the world. The way that they produce their assessments is that they've developed 350 indicators, which are ranked between a scale of 0 and 4. And then they usually have 3 independent experts per indicator, 3 to 5 independent experts per indicator per country, ranking that one. So you have this really broad data set, and then you use a statistical analysis to try and smooth out the differences in observation between the different researchers in the different countries. And so this is kind of an academically driven kind of data set that we have. And if people are interested in this, I encourage you to go to the VDEM website. It's vdem.net. And they have their whole report, their annual report that they do, and you can actually download all of their data on all their 350 plus indicators looking at the different aspects of democracy, like I said, going back to 1789 to the present time. So if people are interested in some of the raw data, you can find it there.
So I think that brings us to the end. So thank you very much, and back to you, Joachim.